Hey guys, it's Tamara coming back at you with another video. Welcome back to my channel. We're going to go ahead and start talking about post-traumatic stress disorder and complex trauma. So I think the benefits for you in this video is that you're just going to be able to define and clearly understand what complex trauma is. And we're going to fit some post-traumatic stress disorder conversations in there as well. So let's just go ahead and jump in and get started, okay? I want to give you some understanding of what complex post-traumatic stress disorder is, and then I'm going to tell you what the effects of complex post-traumatic stress is as well. And this can apply to both kids, adolescents, and I should also add adults in there as well. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with what post-traumatic stress disorder is in a complex sense. Okay, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, typically includes the following: flashbacks, hypervigilance, increased or extreme startle response, changes in mood and affect. And what I mean by affect would be how you're presenting physically on your face to somebody else. We may have physical ailments that start up, so chronic migraine headaches, maybe back problems, maybe heart palpitations, things like that. So physical ailments do start up. It's not common, and it's not in everybody. Everybody's a little bit different, but it does happen. In addition to that, we may see increased anxiety, so difficulty sleeping, and we may also see poor appetite, whether that's overindulgence in food or we're not eating enough. We may also see weight gain in post-traumatic stress disorder because, eating is often off or altered in some fashion. And lastly, we might also find nightmares, and nightmares the majority of the time. One of the reasons why is because when you're dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, the event that has happened to you begins to play itself over and over and over in your mind. And when you entertain those particular thoughts, because they're most likely to be going to be negative if you're thinking of a traumatic event, these negative things play in your mind over and over and over, and I call that rumination. My field calls it rumination. And rumination is fixating your mind on something, and your mind constantly examines it and evaluates it and just goes over it so many times that it's hard for you to get your mind off of it. It almost feels like an obsession, right? The other thing that's important about post-traumatic stress disorder to understand is that you're also going to get intrusive thoughts, and you're going to get intrusive thoughts about the event. And what I mean by intrusive is these thoughts creep into your reality, right? They creep into your awareness of things around you, right? So you could be driving to school or driving to work or dropping your kids off somewhere or having a good time at a housewarming party, or you could be getting ready to give birth, and all of a sudden that traumatic situation just kind of like peaks and leaves, right? Peaks into your awareness and then leaves, right? Comes in for a second, goes out, right? And that's why we call it intrusive, because it's an intrusive thought that invades your privacy, right? It comes in and you're not even aware of it. Neither are you prepared. All right, so that's post-traumatic stress disorder. Let's talk about complex post-traumatic stress disorder. We need to understand that complex PTSD is referring to a pervasive and long-term chronic set of symptoms, right? So all those symptoms we just went over, they become prolonged and pervasive and chronic, right? Complex post-traumatic stress disorder often results from prolonged trauma, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, physical abuse, a terrifying event that occurs multiple times at high frequency, right? Something that's high intensity, and it occurs more than once, more than twice, more than 4 times, right? Complex post-traumatic stress disorder results from that, right? So it's pervasive, chronic, and prolonged. Invasive, interpersonal in nature, okay? It's invasive and interpersonal in nature. It typically occurs within the context of a family. And when you think of complex PTSD, it's good to keep in mind that it usually results from interactions with an unpredictable, unhealthy, emotionally and psychologically disturbed caregiver or parent or a guardian of some kind. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder, when we're thinking about children and adolescents, for example, tends to occur within the context of a relationship of some kind, primarily a relationship that is close to that child in some fashion. There's an uneven power dynamic in most situations where there's complex PTSD. So we may have a parent abusing a child. We may have, God forbid, but a provider abusing their patient. Or we may have a lawyer abusing his client, God forbid, right? So there's this uneven power dynamic, that creates that complex post-traumatic stress disorder. There's often a lot of emotional neglect, I should say, as well as emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, whatever it might be. Emotional neglect is in there as well. I'm having a hard time talking here. I apologize, guys. But emotional neglect may look something like not paying attention to the child, ignoring the child, calling the child names. If you're an adult dealing with this, it could be an abusive domestic violence relationship. It could be a psychologically or emotionally abusive relationship where there's no physical fighting, but it's words, right? It's actions, it's passive aggressive behavior, it's very aggressive verbal behavior. So there's definitely emotional neglect, okay? So let's jump to the effects, right? What happens to you and to the brain and to the body and to the emotions when complex PTSD is the issue? So the first is traumatic bonding, and I talk a lot about this on my channel. I also talk about it on other YouTube channels where I've been interviewed. Traumatic bonding is basically the idea that you are bonded to a person that you love and you care for, and they, with their instabilities, alternate between periods of wonderfulness, right, greatness, love, excitement, to periods of complete torture. And so the traumatic bonding process happens where you're emotionally bonded to that person, and it's so hard that you can't pull away long enough to say, okay, I know that I need to get out of this, and I know that this is wrong, but I love this person. That's traumatic bonding, right? And the person alternates, again, between periods of being wonderful and periods of being horrific, okay? So that's traumatic bonding. So you go through traumatic bonding. You also may have a hard time forming secure relationships and attachments. What I mean by secure attachments and relationships is that you cannot be healthy in the relationship, right? You may be dominating, you may be codependent, you may be emotionally abusive yourself, you may be impulsive, you may make terrible decisions for you and the other person, right? You also may not trust that individual no matter how hard you try. When you don't have a secure attachment, then you begin to behave in the relationship negatively, and it affects the two of you. Family, friends, romantic, whatever the relationship may be, even co-worker relationships. The other thing that often comes along, the effects of complex PTSD, is what I call emotional hiding. And that's when you hide all of your emotions. You don't show anger, you don't show love, you don't show nervousness, hatred, you just hide all of your emotions. You may also begin to avoid, right? So you avoid. The other thing that I added here is you become defensive. And you also internalize. So emotional hiding is what I call avoidance, defensiveness, and internalization of true emotions. Okay, that often occurs. The other thing is recurrent physical ailments. Remember earlier I mentioned headaches and chronic back pain, and you may have fibromyalgia symptoms, or you may have other symptoms as well. But physical ailments is a big one. Okay, emotional dysregulation and hypersensitivity are two things that are also common in complex PTSD as the effects of complex PTSD. Right, the consequences of complex PTSD is often, along with everything else I mentioned, hypervigilance and emotion dysregulation. You can't regulate your emotions, you can't control what you're feeling, and then you're hypervigilant and constantly looking over your shoulder, right? Because you're just afraid, you're hurt, you're fragile, you're vulnerable. All right, guys, thanks so much for being with me today, and I appreciate you sticking around to the end of this video. I know it was a little bit long this time because I did promise a really short video, but this is important information, so I'm glad you guys could be here for that. I encourage you to hit the thumbs up button if this was helpful to you. That makes the video available to other people, which is why I ask every video. If you want to catch more videos like this, we're going to be doing this over a month's period of time, talking about trauma. Go ahead and hit the subscribe button, because then that way you can be notified as soon as I post a video. All right, guys, I wish you all the best, and I'll see you really soon. Bye-bye.